The walls of Blackthorn Manor were closing in. The men's torches flickered wildly, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach for them. In the dead center of the room, Lord William Blackthorn sat motionless, his empty eye sockets fixed on the small, writhing relic before him. The air hummed with whispered voices. Too many. Too close. One of the men took a step back, his breath caught in his throat as he realized they were no longer alone. Figures, dark, shapeless things, were moving in the corners of the room, slowly creeping toward them. The floor beneath their feet groaned like the belly of a starving beast, and then, from William's mouth, came the sound that would haunt them for the rest of their days, a low, guttural growl that didn't belong to anything human. This is the forgotten story of the haunting of Blackthorn Manor. In the early 19th century, deep in the fog-choked moors of northern England, there stood an ancient and crumbling mansion known as Blackthorn Manor. The once grand estate was nestled in a valley overshadowed by towering black trees, from which the manor took its name. Built during the 1600s, the house had passed through many generations of the Blackthorn family, each one more reclusive and eccentric than the last. By the turn of the century, the estate was in ruin, and the Blackthorn name had become a whispered curse in the local village. The story of Blackthorn Manor begins with its last known inhabitant, Lord William Blackthorn. Unlike his predecessors, William was an explorer, a man of science and curiosity. After years of traveling abroad, collecting rare artifacts and ancient relics, he returned to the manor in 1817. But his return was not met with joy, for Lord William had brought something back with him, something unnatural, something dark. The servants whispered of strange happenings from the moment William crossed the threshold. His once brilliant mind seemed fractured, and he spent long hours locked away in his private study, muttering to himself in strange tongues. He had always been a man of curiosity, but now that curiosity had turned inward, toward the unknown, toward the occult. In the months that followed his return, Blackthorn Manor descended into a waking nightmare. The villagers had long feared the house, but their unease grew into dread as rumors of William's practices spread. Visitors and tradesmen began to vanish after entering the gates. The few who returned spoke of strange symbols carved into the walls and of the constant low hum that seemed to echo through the halls at night. Some claimed they had seen strange, shadowy figures moving in the windows after dark, figures that did not belong to any living soul in the house. Lord William was rarely seen, though his presence could always be felt. He had grown pale, his face drawn and haunted, his once sharp blue eyes now dull and hollow. The manor had once been a place of aristocratic splendor, but now it was falling apart. The gardens, once lush and manicured, were overgrown with blackthorn trees and brambles. The great stone facade of the house had begun to crack and crumble, as if the house itself was slowly rotting from the inside. It was said that Lord William had brought back an ancient relic from his travels, an artifact of unknown origin. Some said it was a statue, others claimed it was a book, bound in a language no one could decipher. Whatever it was, it had consumed him. His study became a shrine to it, and strange lights and sounds began to emanate from the room late into the night. The few remaining servants, terrified of their master's madness, fled the estate, leaving the manor in complete isolation. By the winter of 1818, the house stood empty except for Lord William, who was now more of a ghost than a man. Local legend claimed that the manor had fallen under a curse, that something ancient and evil had taken root within its walls. The relic, it was said, was not a mere object but a vessel for a forgotten power, a power that had taken William as its host. The villagers, too frightened to approach, kept their distance. The house became the subject of local superstition, and the Blackthorn name was spoken only in hushed tones. But the curse would not remain contained within the manor's crumbling walls for long. In the spring of 1819, strange things began happening in the village of Graymore, the nearest settlement to Blackthorn Manor. It started with the animals, livestock were found dead in their pens, drained of blood. Then, the village children began disappearing, one by one. The adults searched the fields and moors for miles, but found no trace. The only thing they discovered were small, twisted effigies made of blackthorn branches scattered throughout the woods, silent warnings to stay away. The villagers were gripped by fear, convinced that the curse of Blackthorn Manor had spread to them. A group of brave men armed with torches and pitchforks finally decided to confront Lord William. They made their way up the winding path to the manor one moonless night, determined to put an end to the evil that had taken hold of their village. When they reached the gates of Blackthorn Manor, the men found them wide open, as if they were being invited inside. As they approached the house, they could feel an oppressive presence pressing down on them. The manor loomed above them like a sleeping giant, its windows dark and lifeless. The men forced their way inside and found the interior of the house in complete disarray. The once grand foyer was filled with dust and cobwebs, the furniture rotting and broken, but it was the silence that unnerved them the most. There was no sound of wind, no creak of old wood, only an unnatural stillness that made their skin crawl. They found Lord William in his study, sitting at his desk, his back to them. He did not move or acknowledge their presence. The room was filled with strange markings, symbols carved into the walls, drawn in what looked like blood. The relic, a small twisted statue made of black stone, sat on the desk in front of him, its surface slick and wet, as though it was alive. When one of the men called out to William, he slowly turned to face them. His eyes were empty sockets, his skin as pale as the moonlight filtering through the cracked windows. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out, only a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the room. As the men backed away in horror, the house itself seemed to come alive. The walls groaned and cracked, the floorboards buckled, and the air was filled with the sound of whispered voices, too many to count. Shadowy figures rose from the corners of the room, their twisted forms moving toward the men. In a panic, they fled the manor, abandoning their torches in their haste. The last thing they saw as they ran down the hill was the house collapsing in on itself, as though it was being swallowed by the earth. The villagers never spoke of what happened that night, but the disappearances stopped, and the curse seemed to lift. Blackthorn Manor, or what remained of it, was left to rot, a hollow shell hidden by the overgrowth. Years later, travelers would sometimes stumble upon the ruins, drawn by the eerie silence that surrounded the place. But none would stay long, for the presence of Lord William and his cursed relic lingered, casting a long shadow over the land. Some claimed to see figures moving through the fog at night, or to hear whispers carried on the wind, voices calling out from the darkness. The legend of Blackthorn Manor became just that, a legend. But for those who knew the truth, the house was a tomb for the cursed, a place where the line between the living and the dead had been forever blurred. And though the house had crumbled, the relic remained, hidden deep within the earth, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to disturb it. The story of Blackthorn Manor is a tale of madness, isolation, and the unyielding grip of a forgotten curse. It is the story of a man who brought something dark and unnatural into his home, only to be consumed by it. As the relic's curse spread, so did fear and death in the nearby village. Even after the manor collapsed into ruin, the evil within it lingered, waiting for the next chapter of its dark history to unfold.